I'm one of many in the room today who's been fortunate enough to enjoy air travel. From the steep climb in a DC-3 just to get to my seat as a 4-year-old, to the many trips for business and leisure, to the expansion of air travel to a whole new group of people that discount airlines brought, to a recent flight home where the commercial imperative of on-time departures encouraged people to get into the cylinder and take your seats quickly. I did that and then paused for a moment and reflected on the marvel of air travel and pondered how many people had thought about the highly skilled and trained professional people on the flight deck preparing for a safe flight for us all. Our guest today is one of those professionals. In an article for Traveller magazine some years ago, Captain Georgina Sutton vividly recalls the day when she received a life-changing phone call from QANTAS. She had lodged an application to be a pilot with them. Georgina was in Port Augusta piloting a Cessna 421 for a small regional airline, and the flight was delayed, as they often are. She is quoted that she got the message to ring QANTAS, and she says, and I quote, "I remember I came out after the call and said to the passengers, 'We're still delayed, but I've got a job with QANTAS with the new 747-400. It was an exciting time," she recalls. Georgina has clocked up a number of important firsts in her career thus far, which I'm sure she'll share or cover some of those with us today. I simply just wanted to remind us all that when we turn right getting on board our next flight, think about the people on the left, up the pointy end, preparing for the flight. The chances are they've worked with and for and respect our special International Women's Day guest keynote speaker, Captain Georgina Sutton, FRAeS. Please make her welcome.
Thanks very much, Peter. You stole one of my stories. I'll have to be flexible. Great research. So thanks, Peter and Adriano. Thank you very much. I feel very honoured. Dad said to me I've got to speak into this because deaf people in the room, not including him. So can everyone hear me adequately? So I'd also like to acknowledge that we meet on Kaurna land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also think it's just fantastic to be invited here for International Women's Day. I usually do speak somewhere in Australia at the moment. Who knows, it could be the world one day on this day. And I think it's very, very important that we do acknowledge this day. So the actual day, I was at a place called Morgan on the Murray River where I was acknowledged also, which was lovely after having skied 200 kilometres on a charity ski event. So it's lovely to be back again celebrating this day again. As I was walking in here, Adelaide Oval, I was thinking, what does Adelaide Oval mean to me? Now, firstly, obviously the Crows. Sorry about the Port supporters. Many a showdown win. I don't know where the tally's at the moment, sitting behind the goals, watching, I think it was Steve Smith get an inaugural 200 at one of the tests, Ashes with a pink ball, where we've come. But the most memorable memory was, I did spend 5 years in the South Australian Police Force, which I'll go into in a moment, but it was literally my first week as a probationary constable, and my duty was to patrol the boundary at one of the one-day games. So the hill was full, the place was full, I forget who we were playing. And we'd received fairly rudimentary training in those days, but what we did not receive any training was the experience that I had when a naked man ran out of the hill and streaked heading south, and my partner was nowhere to be seen, and I chased after the offender, and then, I mean, what's one to do? So I just took my hat off and covered the offending part and left and it's on TV actually. I saw it on one of those documentaries about Kerry Packer. So that's my most vivid memory of Adelaide Oval, is escorting a streaker off the ground without any training. So without further ado, my flying career took a really circuitous route, and I suppose that's sort of one of the purposes of today's presentation. My first flight, I'll get this happening, on pressing, is it because the off and on, hold on, I might have done it, that's it, I think. No? Thanks. I can just press down on this. We tested it before we even started. I think it's a laptop. Let's talk amongst yourselves. Yeah. It's all right. I fly 787, so I'll just ad lib while we chat. And engineers used to come up in the old days with shifters and screwdrivers and things like that. Now they come up with a laptop. That's how they repair a 787. Beautiful. All good. Thank you. Lovely. Well done. So I was born in the 60s, sometime or other, we'll leave it at that, in Adelaide. And this was my first flight. As you can see there, the hills at Parafield with Mum in a Beechcraft Musketeer. And I still remember that flight. I was probably about 7. And that feeling of lifting off, that getting into the third dimension that we do when we fly or we scuba dive, is something else I enjoy doing. I didn't really have any other interaction with flying. I hadn't really had any. I had an uncle that flew, but I didn't really know him. But something must have happened, because from about the age of 15, every school holidays, I'd be building Airfix models and hanging them from my lovely Queen Anne 4-poster bed in Beaumont, which wasn't really a thing to do, but there they hung. And so I think there was something there about flying that was sitting there in the background. And I sort of knew there was something for me outside of school, but I didn't really know what it was until Dad, my father, Peter Sutton, who I will acknowledge there with my sister-in-law Naomi Sutton and my lovely niece Georgia. We've got 3 generations of Suttons here, which is fantastic. Dad said, we were water skiing up at our little shack on the Murray, which we still do. We've got to go up to the Scout Flying Club at Blanchetown and help prepare the airstrips, because Dad was involved in the Scouts. We have bought this land, and of course it was 34-degree day. It was flat glass, calm, and I'm going, I don't want to go to Blanchetown, I want to be water skiing. No, that's a fun thing to do. So we all went up there, and Nolan and Lucas were there, and we were using the cars and preparing this airstrip, and it was dusty and horrible. And then I went for a flight in a glider, and that's when everything changed. So that's the glider, an ES-49, which is a wooden fabric glider. Interesting T-shirt I'm wearing, wouldn't be allowed today, but it was the go. With the front tail skid, you can see that, and it was towed aloft by a Dodge winch with fencing wire, literally. And that was a 2-seater training glider. And I went for a flight in that glider, and I was absolutely hooked. I actually went for a number of flights that weekend and met a whole lot of people called Venturer Scouts, which are 14 to 18-year-olds. And I was absolutely hooked. I got straight back home and said to Dad, I need to find, a Venturer Scout unit, and I want to go flying. And he says, well, okay, yeah, probably thinking it was like ponies, how girls go through that pony era, boys go through motorbike eras. Anyway, so I joined Davenport Venturers, and there's 2 ex-Venturer Rover people here, Austin and Brenton Wittenbury, at the table, so they'll call me out on any inaccuracies. But every second weekend I drove to Blanchetown, to Armstrong Airfield, and went flying in a glider for 4-minute flights. So we usually got about 3 of those a day, and the rest of the day you would do work towing the winch cable and just doing things that you do in Scouts to take other Scouts flying. So I did that, and at 16 I was passenger rated, took my biology teacher flying, Jennifer Harvey, and took all the Seymour girls up for 2 years in a row up to the flying club to experience flying. Scouts Australia recognises the following values: the importance of individuals developing a sense of personal identity and self-worth, which leads to responsibility for oneself and one's actions as a citizen. The belief that young people are able and willing to take responsibility and contribute to society. So that's the values off their website today as existed at the time. And the values and the confidence building that was enshrined in Scouting, very much led by the values of Scouting, but also the fantastic leadership team that we had in Scouts at the time, were really key to enable me to develop the confidence and the resilience to embark on a really non-traditional career pathway. Excuse me. So at 17 I then converted to power flying and was towing the tug planes at Waikerie and instructing as well on the gliders at Waikerie. I also achieved the Queen's Scout Award through doing those sorts of things, lots of fun in the outback and canoeing and caving and those sorts of things, plus community service with the Burnside CFS. So this was in 1977, and I was then thinking, what am I going to do for a career? And there's something very interesting phase that you can't be what you can't see. And at that time, Debbie Wardley, anyone remember Debbie Wardley? I'll get to her story in a minute. Nor any other women for that matter were flying for a commercial airline in Australia. It's sort of unfathomable to think about it now, I'm sure. But this is young Debbie. I'll just briefly pause for her story because I think it's really important that people like Debbie pave the way for people like me. As I say, you can't be what you can't see, and there was no one doing this work. So it's very important that people like me do share these stories. So if you just reflect back, the case of Wardley versus Ansett Transport Industries was the first sex discrimination employment case contested before the Equal Opportunity Board. Reg Ansett denied the allegation of discrimination, but admitted that it was his strong personal view that women were not suited to be airline pilots. This is really interesting, but it's led to a public demonstration marches in August 79, so I was still just out of school then, and a successful girlcott, rather than a boycott, so girlcott. So businesses were, exactly what it was, encouraged by women to transfer their travel accounts from Ansett to QANTAS. And in the first 6 months, Ansett lost more than 50% of its business travel, and a lot never returned just on principle. We know what happened poor on Ansett. In a letter to the Secretary of the Women's Electoral Lobby, the General Manager of Ansett wrote, "Ansett has adopted a policy of only employing men as pilots. This does not mean that women cannot be good pilots, but we're concerned with the provision of the safest and most efficient air service possible." I don't quite know how that... In this regard, we feel that all male pilot crew is safer than one in which the sexes are mixed. So Ansett raised a number of objections to the employment of women as pilots, including that pilots needed strengths, even though there was no strength test for pilots. The unions would object. Women's menstrual cycles make them unsuitable. I've seen some pretty moody men, let me give you the word. Pregnancy and childbirth would disrupt a woman's career to the point where it would jeopardise safety and incur extra cost. And this was Ansett's main legal argument. The Victorian Equal Opportunity Board ruled that Ansett's refusal to employ Wardley was illegal. It awarded damages and ordered Ansett to include her in the next pilot training program. But it didn't stop there, of course. Ansett delayed the training and appealed to the Supreme Court, and that appeal was dismissed. And then they appealed the Supreme Court decision to the High Court of Australia. I mean, it's pretty serious stuff, having women in aeroplanes. But they employed Debbie Wardley from the 5th of November pending the case. During classroom training, Ansett attempted to sack her by claiming she'd been at fault in a near-miss incident at Moorabbin, despite an inquiry exonerating her and identifying the other pilot at fault. Ansett backed down after the union stepped in. I mean, what this poor woman went through is just incredible. When she finished her training, she was not assigned to training aircraft, but her male colleagues were. And at that stage, Ansett had been taken over by Peter Abels and Rupert Murdoch, and Wardley had previously trained Rupert's brother-in-law, John Calvert-Jones, to fly. She telephoned him, informed him, and essentially Rupert Murdoch instructed Ansett to start her training. She commenced her first commercial flight, co-piloting a Fokker 27 from Alice Springs to Darwin, and the rest was history. The High Court dismissed Ansett's appeal in March 1980, and the case is still used as a precedent. So the reason why I mentioned that story, and sorry it's a bit longer and I'm on a time schedule, but I think it's important for us to step back and reflect on someone who really was at a time just in front of me, who had to pave the way such that I would be able to be employed by Qantas later on. So this was all going on, and I'd enjoyed the CFS and scouting and that sort of thing, so I thought, well, I'll apply for the South Australian Police for glamorous uniforms in those days. That was the hat, actually, that did the deed. Yeah, it was that hat. Interesting. So I became a South Australian Police officer and really enjoyed that. I did catch Darren Mark being the Ash Wednesday, who lit Ash Wednesday, which was a cool thing to do. But I then thought, well, I'd like to get into the air wing because that would be really good. I'd completed my commercial licence. I used the police force sort of to fund my way through that. I drove out to Parafield doing subjects 2 nights a week at the TAFE out there. And I applied to the Air Wing, and they just wouldn't let me in, and no one would explain. So years later, under FOI, just for interest, I went and got the documentation that discriminated against me. I mean, who cares now? I know SAPOL have got very progressive policies now, but interesting story with all the ironic story. I was flying a 767 from Adelaide to Singapore one day, and that particular police officer, who was senior, retired, was on that flight. The one that said that I couldn't join the Air Wing. Anyway, so I left the police force after 5 years with a commercial licence, and was really luckily employed by a lovely family called the Rashid family up at Wilpena Pound, and they took me on with a bare commercial licence as they do, and they've had probably now about 6 Qantas pilots and 7 Jetstar pilots who've worked for them and given them a start. And that started a career in general aviation that took me from Broome, Darwin, Port Augusta and the Birdsville track and back to Adelaide. And yes, that hot Port Augusta day I got that phone call, and I couldn't believe it. We were broken down. I had all the regular passengers, the optometrists, the people that tested the water in the Leigh Creek, because we were going Adelaide, Port Augusta, Leigh Creek. And they were so thrilled, and they actually threw a lunch for me when I left and gave me a piece of coal, which probably isn't that cool now, but it was then, and some flowers. But I was going straight from the 421, which is a 10-seater piston engine commuter aircraft, onto a 747-400, and I'm going the brand new, like literally brand new. And they sent me off to Singapore and New Zealand to do training, and I didn't know what had hit me. And they give you money when you get to the hotel to pay for things. Like, it was just incredible. And I'd been in 5 years in GA, which was pretty lean and mean, and I'd only ever been to Kangaroo Island overseas, pretty much. And next thing, I was off to London to see the Queen, which is something I actually did do a couple of years later. Was on one of the Royal flights, which was a highlight for my career, flying the Queen and Prince Philip from London to Singapore. And we had a Nimrod shadowing us, and we had an Orion shadowing us into Singapore, and we had to do the steepest climb procedure because the IRA were active then, so they didn't shoot us down, and we had MI6 following us. So I thought they were up in the air conditioning vents watching, when you're getting in the... We had to be cleared by, Interpol and all of that. And that was a real honour. I wonder if I'll make it on the Crown. I haven't got to that part of the series yet, but... that was definitely a really big honour, particularly as a Queen Scout. And my role was to obviously fly the aeroplane, but as a second officer to put her... She has a standard when she leaves Heathrow, or Her Royal Highness, and that's, like the flag, Royal Standard. And then when you go into a non-Commonwealth country or Commonwealth country, you put another flag up. So my role was to stick it up in the bubble through a hatch with this bracket arrangement, then pull it down and put the hatch up, just as we're putting takeoff thrust on. So that was a bit of fun. And, if I didn't get it right, we'd have to reject the takeoff. So, yeah, second officer on the 7400 for a while. I've lost my counter, there it is. And then that's 747. What I cut out of that is actually I've got some scones on my knee, but I just didn't think that would look that cool. I then went on to the 767, which was a much-loved aeroplane in Qantas, and I actually became the fleet manager of that fleet, and that was a wonderful day leaving Melbourne with the Melbourne Cup and the owners on board. So I put the cup on the captain's seat with a hat on it. That was a bit of fun. So I became the fleet manager, which was the first female management pilot in Qantas, and of course, standard women, you can have this job, it's all good. By the way, we're retiring the 767s really early, and a whole lot of pilots will have to be demoted in that change process. So I was up for it, but it was a huge challenge with this accelerating, a bit like we're facing at the moment, actually, with the 380 pilots who are all going to be grounded for a few months. I can take some questions on that later. But I just got a really quick course in change management, and to get that role was an interesting process to go through, in a very male-dominated environment, but I did get the role, and I think a lot of credit with the team that worked with me in how we moved those pilots from the 767, demoted generally, as in down in rank, to other aircraft, which was a pretty difficult thing for them, and being able to take people through change is a whole other subject, but something I'm very passionate about. After that, the role of the Jetstar chief pilot position became available, and when I'd gone into the fleet manager position in Qantas, they put me into a formalised mentoring program under a company called McCarthy Mentoring that was run by a lady then called Wendy McCarthy, who was actually my mentor, which was I was just blown away. I didn't really understand the value of that, and I think the key to transitioning into senior leadership roles is, for women particularly, or people from minority groups, is support from the organisations. And I was really, really fortunate to be placed on that program, and I think that's what quality organisational support looks like, because it's a code. I mean, there's this corporate language and there's financial language, and everyone speaks it. If you don't know the code, you can't speak it, you can't walk it or talk it. A lot of it's really BS, really. It's sort of, you know, once you understand it, but you've got to know how to speak that language. And mentoring gave that to me, and also understanding how to write a CV. You know, how to write a really succinct CV, how to do an interview. So, you know, I was standing up in front of the mirror, which is just horrible, but doing interview, checking in your body language and that sort of thing. You don't know that if you're a pilot. You just go and fly an aeroplane and do all the right things. So it was a whole different part that mentoring brought to me, which is so important. The other issue is women, particularly women, men suffer from it, but to a great lesser degree, is a syndrome called Imposter Syndrome. They've got it wrong. How did I get to be I still feel it, and it's nonsense, but you look it up and there's a whole PhD's written on the thing. And many, many women feel this. How did I get here? They've got it wrong. So here's someone who suffers from imposter syndrome. Now, Meryl Streep firmly believes this and just battles that feeling. Why on earth would they want me to act? Now, I mean, how crazy making is that? So this whole thing about imposter syndrome is something that does particularly hold women and people from minority groups, that hold them back, because they must be wrong. So when this position was advertised in Jetstar, I had to get over a lot of that and walk into the interview with confidence and get over any fears and doubts. And the strange paradox for me applying for the Jetstar chief pilot role was that I was really comfortable facing these simulator checks we do. And they're hard, they're really hard, and you have to pass. If you don't pass, you're taken offline. So they're do or die sort of things. And, you know, engines out, hydraulics, multiple things. And I was much happier doing that than I was going into an interview. So it's really interesting what that says. So as I went into that interview well, there were a series of interviews, but one was here in the Chairman's Lounge with Jane Hilliker, and I was absolutely petrified, flying over on Jetstar to demonstrate the values and all that sort of stuff. And I remember Alison Watkins, CEO of Coca-Cola Amatil, I heard speak at a conference, and she said, "Ladies, check your egos in at the door," because as women particularly, we don't feel comfortable talking about how good we are and all the great things we've done. I'll leave the conclusions you can draw to that. So there I am there with a young cadet pilot in Jetstar, which was a fantastic experience down in Melbourne. I was flying the 787 Dreamliner, leading a team managing 900 pilots in Australia and New Zealand. We championed just culture improvements in safety. We worked closely on our corporate culture and organisational structure, taking what was a fairly small airline culture into a very, very large airline culture. I mean, Jetstar flew 22 million customers for under $100 in a single year, and that gives a whole bucket load of demographic of people. And Jetstar cops it sometimes, but there's a whole demographic of people there that can fly that ordinarily wouldn't have been able to do that. So that was a pretty cool thing. We strengthened the dual brand strategy with Qantas and Jetstar, and a really cool thing that did happen then was when Qantas bought its 787s, the Jetstar check and training pilots trained the Qantas pilots in how to fly that aircraft, which was just fantastic, and same with the engineers as well. I returned to Qantas probably about 18 months ago, flying our 787, which I still fly now as a check and training captain between Perth and London and everywhere else it flies. It's about to go to Perth, London twice a day for the next little while. And that's a fantastic experience while I'm also running the base, so training first officers to be captains and training people from other fleets onto the 787 is a really great mix. From the pilot recruitment perspective, Qantas really recognises that there's some challenges there in relation to women. We're still only 4% of the population in pilot land, so we've got some pretty aggressive recruiting strategies, particularly for our cadet systems and the pilot academies that have started up in Toowoomba. Our goal is to inspire young women to pursue careers in technical aviation, educating girls and women about the career opportunities and pathways, and supporting women who already hold jobs in technical aviation. The gender balance statistics now is that in 2019, 13.5% of pilots hired across the Qantas group were female. Where to next? So that's us in Indigenous painted aircraft on the ground in Heathrow, and one of those pilots there is actually Indigenous, Troy Lane. If anyone's flown on Qantas in the last week or so, you'll see our 100-year anniversary video, and he's the guy at the end, so he's the one on the far right. So that was pretty special. That was my first flight into Heathrow from Perth. So taking off from little old Perth, poor cousin, to Adelaide with eucalyptus trees and all the rest of it, and then to fly right up across Italy, the Middle East, Europe, and land at Heathrow in one hit is just an absolute pleasure. So that's one of the highlights of my role, is to be able to jump in a jet and to go for a fly off to London as we do and see the Queen. That's all I have. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I've gone over time.
Georgina's arm will recover, but we've twisted it a bit to get her to answer some questions. So, Steve Larkins, relax. You're acknowledged. Please ask your question. There's a microphone behind you.
Georgina, thank you very much. I just wonder if anybody looked back in time when questioning, the role of women in aviation to the ferry pilots in World War II. Hundreds of them. So was that never recognised, flying aircraft transatlantic all over the place, delivering them to forward bases and so on?
Yeah, you're quite right. No, it wasn't. No, it never referenced. Yeah, I don't know why it didn't get used in the court case or whatever, just conveniently forgotten. Yeah, you're quite right. Very good point. Hi.
Over the back there, table 9.
Hello. Hi. I was just wondering, what would your advice be for young girls that would be also suffering, what your advice about imposter syndrome for young girls?
Yeah, it's really debilitating. Get a mentor. And when I say that, they're not, you can go and buy one or a company, but you can find, they don't have to be female actually, I had 3 in that period, a lady in Qantas who was just terrific, and Wendy McCarthy, and another colleague who's actually younger than me, but very, very experienced in the corporate world. And so you don't have to have one. It is just the best way. And a mentor is not a coach. Their coaches do different things. They talk about techniques and that sort of thing, whereas mentors have got a little bit of therapist element, completely confidential, and when you ring them up and you're having an irrational moment, is just to ring them in. Wendy used to say to me when I'd go for an interview, breathe. Because first thing we do in unusual attitude training now is stop and we actually enunciate breathe, because you're generally going in an interview and you're not breathing and that sort of thing. So get a mentor. Just find someone, and you'll know who the right person. If there's someone who's been in business, is helpful if you're in that corporate world. But just go and to be asked to be a mentor is a really great privilege as well, of course. So it's not just telling people to get, but actually there's people here who are well capable of being mentors. So have a think about that. There might be someone who's in need of some mentoring.
David Egan.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, Georgina. I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but I think it's a really important. This is more of a comment. Thank you, Peter. I'm not sure what year it was, but the Rotary Club of Adelaide had the privilege of listening to Amy Johnson as the first female pilot to fly from England to London to Australia, and today we've got you. So that is fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Georgina. Do you know what the percentage of military pilots are female now, as well as in, say, domestic? If there's
That's a really good question. And one of the other people that I've spent some time with is a lady called Elizabeth Broderick, who you may want to know, who used to be the chair of the Equal Opportunities Commission, is now runs a consultancy company. So she went into the military because they had some pretty serious issues with both gender equality and also culture, with the issues that were happening in the academy there, some pretty awful things. And they came up with a program, and some of it did involve some positive affirmation, so I'm talking about actual bias to employ women. So they had to go to that length to get the proportions of women to where they needed to be, because right at that time, the test you always put to this is, would I be happy with my daughter, niece, sister working in that organisation? So when the old days of the nude photos on the back of the locker wall or whatever, would we be happy for our daughters to be working in that environment? At that stage, who would want their daughter to go and be an officer at ADFA when there's all that stuff going on? So look, I know their direct entry, it's probably about 40%, I think, and they've put some really interesting programs in place where you can go to the military and do it sort of, not necessarily for flying, but in some of the STEM roles, where you can go and try before you buy. So you can go for a year and try it out, because usually there's these 8-year return of service. So they've put some pretty interesting things in place. I don't have the exact statistic, but I know that we have looked at some of the programs that they've used to see how we can improve, because as was mentioned in some earlier presentation, the stats aren't actually trending that well. So we've got a lot more to do to make it attractive for women to go into those roles.
A quick one, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Georgina. I thought that was a really very interesting address. I just want to share with you a flight that my wife and I took on International Women's Day.
Here's what happened to me on Qantas Story.
No, we were flying.
I don't get any of those.
No, this is just a thought. We were flying from New Delhi to Colombo on Air India, and they put in their newspaper in New Delhi, they were going to fly all women crews on as many flights as possible. And they promoted that, and then when we got to the airport, my wife was given a rose when she was booking in. So it was just a nice touch. So
they're doing fantastic things.
So
I've met a couple of their pilots who are colleagues, and they're going gangbusters. I don't know what it is about Indian culture that lends itself to that, but I know they're terrific. I'm on LinkedIn with a couple of Indian pilots. Any more?
No, I think...
I've got one. No?
Very brief, Albert.
It's very, very brief. I watched a really stupid movie recently where the pilot had a heart attack and the co-pilot and a guy with rudimentary abilities in flying was able to bring the plane down. Is that absolute bullshit?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't... as second officer, we used to dream of the other crew dying so we could land and be the hero. We did, get a field promotion and all that. Look... The first thing that someone would do is probably press the switch that they think would be, because you've got to talk to someone, and that big switch on the control column is the autopilot disconnect switch. So if you can get beyond not disconnecting the autopilot and talk to someone who can tell you what buttons to push when, because the airplane can do auto lands at some airports, but you've got to pull the flaps out, you can put the gear down, you've got to wind the speed back. Technically, yes, but you need... someone who can... We've got to be able to talk on the radio for starters, so, yeah.
I'll come around this side.
I don't know if I answered that adequately. Is there a supplementary question, or...?
Very adequate for Albert.
Oh, right.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hate cutting this short, but just before lunch, Georgina was kind enough to autograph a couple of books, QF 32 and QF 72. I encourage you to read them. Richard de Crepney and Kevin Sullivan. It's about two amazing characters who save lives in Airbus accidents or potential accidents. And I think it gets back to my introductory point. Please, next time you get on the plane, look right, look through the door, see if Georgina's there, but at least think about her colleagues, because by crikey, they do a wonderful job. Georgina, it's been an absolute pleasure having you, and to celebrate you being with us today, we have a certificate, Captain Georgina Sutton, FR, a Fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society, FRAeS, for addressing a lunch, and a donation to Rotary to End Polio is being made in your name. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank
and
you
there's
very
a
much.
photographer here.
Okay.
That's right. Georgina Sutton. Thanks, mate. Well done.